Hello everybody, welcome to today's Transformative Teachers webinar. We are joined by Tricia Thrasher. Thank you very much for joining us today, Tricia.
Thank you for having me, Lucy. I'm excited to be here.
Great, and we're on the opposite side of, well, almost the opposite side of the world to each other. I'm in the southeast of England and you are?
I am just south of Chicago, Illinois, so central US. Yeah, so it's morning over here. It's snowing. It's pretty cold. I hope y'all don't have snow.
Snowing, gosh. Pouring with rain here, but not quite snowing. And I hope everybody can hear us. Can you type in the chat box where you are joining us from, please? Where in the world are you? A quiet chat. Oh, Ireland.
I went on a vacation there. It was very nice. Yeah, it was really pretty. Okay, UK, India. Nice. We have some good.
Okay. Okay, so relative. Oh, okay.
Venice, also a great city.
Great. Incredible city. Wow. I suppose you don't want to be there when it's pouring with rain, though. So, oh, lovely. Okay. Great, great. So let's do a little bit of housekeeping. Okay, so the recording of this webinar you can find at this website address here, and I will put the link up again at the end of the webinar so that you can see it. It's essentially the same place that you go to register. So where you register for webinars, you can also find all of the recordings of previous webinars. On your screen, you should be able to see myself, Lucy, and Tricia, and possibly Luke, who's there in the background, who's just a black screen. Your video and your microphones are off, but you can use the chat box and the Q&A box. So the chat box if Tricia asks a question, the Q&A box if you have a particular question that you would like her to answer. And I just want to point out that in the chat box there's two drop-down options. One of them is the message for everyone, and the other one is the message to hosts and panelists. So if you want your message to be seen by everybody, then please make sure you select the everybody from the drop-down box. And this webinar will be no more than an hour, so we will be finished by 5 o'clock UK time. Okay, right. So I'll stop sharing and I shall introduce our speaker today. So Tricia is the research manager at Immerse, which is a VR language learning company. She's published in a number of prestigious journals and is the associate chair of the Calico Immersive Realities Special Interest Group. She began her language journey with an undergraduate degree in French and went on to do a postgraduate degree in France, where she also taught English. So she has that background, and she became interested in virtual reality during her PhD course at the University of Illinois and specialized in doing in-depth research into virtual reality, including looking at how the brain responds in various learning environments, which I find fascinating. She's particularly interested in the relationship between language learning and anxiety reactions, which has led her to examine how virtual reality technology can be integrated in a way which improves learning conditions and learning outcomes, which she's going to talk to us about today. Tricia, is there anything that I've missed out that you would like to add?
I'll talk a little bit about my background too, but I think that's a great intro. Thank you, Lucy.
Right, over to you then.
I'll go ahead and share my screen just to confirm, Lucy, you can see that.
Yes.
So thank y'all for having me. Like Lucy said, my name is Tricia. I'm the research manager at a company called Immerse, which is essentially a virtual reality language learning company. If you don't know what that is or what that means, that's totally fine. You're in the right place. We'll talk about that. And yeah, so I'm going to start a little bit with like my experience with VR and language learning. So what brought me here? As Lucy said, I decided to do my doctoral degree at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And in my first fall semester, I got to try out a VR application for the first time. called Immerse Me. And essentially what Immerse Me is it's an application where students can put on a headset and then they're in these different environments where they interact with like computer characters in the target language. And so I saw this and was like immediately floored, honestly. It was like, I want to do something with this, but I didn't know what, because this was like my first introduction. And like Lucy said, I was really interested in foreign language anxiety. And so I started reading and looking at, okay, is there any connection here? Has anyone looked at if these environments are less intimidating? Because my initial like feeling was that they probably would be. And there was some research done, but not in virtual reality. There was more research done on like desktop computers. So that was kind of the gap that I was like looking at filling. So in 2019, in the spring, I conducted my first pilot study in VR. And I say VR in quotation marks because it was very low tech. So basically what I did is I worked with someone to record a 360 video where students were interacting with me when they would put on a headset. So it was really like my entry level, like very short, just kind of testing things out. And then I moved on to conduct some more in-depth research from fall of 2019 up until now. So I won't get into a lot of detail just because for the sake of time, but I've conducted research in a variety of language learning or a variety of virtual reality platforms with different language learners looking at a variety of different things. My main dissertation, like Lucy was saying, was looking at foreign language anxiety and basically at how virtual reality can lower both physiological, so things like heart rate and cortisol levels, and ultimately, and self-report anxiety as well, and ultimately lead to better learning outcomes and oral production in French specifically. And then I also have worked on projects where I've taught ESL to learners in Spain using VR, and just some other like telecollaborative exchanges with students using virtual reality. And then I've also used it in my teaching as well. And I'll talk about that a little bit as we go through. But all that to say is I finally graduated in May of 2022 at the end of my doctoral work. And now I'm working as the research manager at Immerse. So it was a perfect fit, kind of right place, right time. But all that to say is I only got started in 2018, which really was not that long ago. It's only 4 years. So I guess my takeaway is don't be intimidated. I think a lot of people hear about VR and they're like, where do I begin? There's so much to do. And there is a learning curve, but it's smaller than you may think.
And it sounds like everything you're going to talk about is tried and tested by yourself.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
you've been
Yeah. And everything I'm going to talk about is pre-built. I'm not going to teach you how to build in VR. I don't know how to build in VR. I'm not a programmer. So yeah, it's all stuff that's already available for you. So very briefly, I do want to do these little introduction questions just so I have a better understanding of kind of who we're talking to. So you don't have to answer all these. If you just want to pick one, you can drop it in the chat. Have you ever used VR at all? If not, again, that's totally fine. You're in the right place. But if you have, what headset have you used? And that can range all the way from something like a Quest Pro to Google Cardboard. Have you ever taught with VR? And do you have any hope with using, or any, I guess, goals with trying to introduce VR in your classroom, or what interests you about it?
So please, anything that you would like to contribute there, put in the chat. It may be that nobody has any idea about VR, which was certainly my position a few weeks ago.
Yeah,
and
that's totally fine.
There's a lot available to
Just
know.
Google Cardboard. Okay, that's a good starting point, though. Also, I'll say while we're waiting on everyone, I am getting over a cold. So if I have to mute myself to cough or drink a bunch of water, my apologies in advance. But it's that time of year. Okay, cool. So you did the Van Gogh exhibition. That I have not done that. I've been wanting to do that, but it's definitely an interesting use case.
It's good to have experience using it as well, really, isn't it? Just to see how it feels and
yeah,
on that side of things.
Increasing by amazing. Awesome. Yeah, I will say a lot of people use it for gaming. And y'all will see as we're going through, there's a variety of different kind of like VR headsets, VR applications. Like there's not only one thing you can do. You can take it in a lot of different directions based on what you want to do with your students. So I'll show you some examples of that. I'm gonna go ahead and go through the overview. Feel free to keep putting your answers in the chat. So we'll start with defining VR to make sure we're all on the same page. What does this term even mean? Because it's not always clear and people have different definitions. I'm going to very briefly touch on affordances of VR. So like what is it good for in previous research, just to give you some ideas of like why would you might want to use this. But we're not going to spend too much time on this. Most of our time is going to be spent looking at different types of VR devices, different kind of, I call them categories of applications that you can get started looking at. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my top apps that I've used for like research and teaching that I think have a lower learning curve and kind of have a lot of things pre-built. And then we'll talk just some general tips and advice on like integrating VR, kind of just some practical tips I have and takeaways from doing it so often. How do we get headsets? So that's a major question that I'm sure a lot of you have. I will be talking about that at the end. And then also potential downsides, because like I said, there's lots of different things you can do with this. It's an emerging technology and it's not perfect. So I don't want anyone to get the idea that I'm saying it's the end all be all, because it's definitely not. So what is VR? That's a great starting point. So in general, people have divided virtual reality into two different categories. We have what's called low immersion VR, and that is essentially things that are accessed via a desktop computer. So no headset involved. That would be something like Second Life that's really popular, if any of you are familiar with that. The Sims has even been called low immersion VR, if anyone's familiar with that game. But anything that you'd be accessing from your computer screen. Versus high immersion VR, that is something that actually involves putting on a headset, or what we call head-mounted devices. So you might occasionally see the term HMD. That's just referring to something like this.
So Tricia, does that mean that if a teacher has a computer in their classroom, they could go ahead and do some VR with their students already?
On the desktop. And actually that's a great question, Lucy. All the apps I'm talking about today, I'm pretty sure, I'll check as we're going through, but they're all available on desktop and in headsets.
Amazing.
I chose them intentionally, so that way you're not, if you don't have a headset, it's not quite the same experience. Obviously the immersion factor is different, but you can still access it. You can still do some really interesting things.
So that could be a great way to start, especially if the teachers or the school don't really know much about virtual reality. So there's no big cost like investing in the headsets, and they can try it out and learn about it and then go from there.
And I would actually recommend, in terms of headsets, and we'll talk more about this at the end, if you do decide to invest some money in headsets, I would not get like a set of 30. I would get like one, maybe two or three, because it is expensive. And we'll talk about costs as we go through, but you can still do a lot of different things with even like 2 or 3 headsets in your classroom. You don't need one for every student.
Tricia, there's a question in the chat here. I'm not sure what it means, but you will. Can participants use both LIV and HIV in the same meeting?
Yeah, so Jeremy is asking low immersion and high immersion. So basically, could some join from desktop and some join from a headset? Typically, yes. It depends on the platform. So most platforms, though, their goal is to be as accessible as possible. From the business standpoint, they want as many people in there as possible. So most of them have the option to where you can have people in headset and you can have people on desktop. And it works well. And we'll talk, sometimes students, even if you have them in a headset, sometimes students have nausea or just they're not fully comfortable. So some of them prefer to join in the desktop anyways.
That's great. That's all very doable, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, so this is what high immersion VR, just so we're on the same page. Basically, as I'm going to go through this, when I say VR, I'm referring primarily to this. But again, all the apps we're going to be looking at will be accessible on both. It's more when I talk about the research and the affordances, I'm specifically talking about this type. And so why should we care about VR? Aside from like the benefits to learning, is I just want to point out a few statistics that I think are interesting. So 8.52 million headsets were bought in 2022 alone. And that number is predicted to increase to, I can't remember what the number is, I'm sorry, but increase substantially over the next few years. Some of this is spurred by COVID, or was spurred by COVID and kind of the move to online learning. And some of it is also just spurred by the fact that this technology is becoming more affordable over time. Here's my estimate. So 43.5 million are expected to be bought per year until 2025. And it's predicted that in education alone, we're going to see a 28% growth in VR usage. So I do really feel like we're going to be seeing more of these types of talks that I'm giving, more teachers wanting to experiment with this, more students wanting to experiment with it. So it's great that y'all are all here. We can kind of get on the same page.
Right. So it's happening anyway. So why not be part of it right now?
It's happening. Again, I don't personally, you have some people who would say the metaverse is here and we're going to be doing, I don't think we're to the point where we need to be doing everything in VR. I don't think that's feasible or even best practice. But I do think that there are some ways we can enhance what we're doing in the classroom. These are some commonly cited affordances of VR. So just pointing these out really quickly. Immersion, obviously it is an extremely immersive experience. If you've never put on a VR headset, I encourage you to try as soon as you can. I wish we were in person so I could let you try some, because it's one of those things that's really hard to explain the feeling if you haven't done it, but you do really feel like you're there. And that's also what they mean when they say a sense of presence. So that just means that you feel like you're in the virtual world, even if you're not really there and you know that you're not really there. A lot of these environments are very interactive. So you can pick up objects, you can interact with them, you can manipulate them, you can build things with other people in these environments. Embodiment is obviously a huge component, and emotions as well. So this is something that, or affective factors, this is what I was researching in my work, is we do have a lot of studies showing that, being in VR does increase motivation and engagement. It reduces things like foreign language anxiety. Research has also shown that it can lead to better learning outcomes and retention and memory, particularly for vocabulary, because you're learning in the context. So for example, like if I'm learning the word, I don't know, cup in Spanish, and I'm actually in a kitchen and I'm able to pick it up in VR, I'm most likely going to remember it a lot better than if I was just looking at the word on a flashcard. And then that being said, it has been found to lead to better learning performance, improved confidence, and more authentic communication. So there is research showing that it's effective. And in terms of language learning specifically, a lot of researchers and teachers have been interested in it because you can virtually transport students to these culturally relevant locations. So using VR, if I'm teaching French, I can actually virtually transport my students to a Francophone city, and they can walk around and feel as if they're really there, versus like watching a video or something. Similarly, you can create L2 simulations. It's very collaborative in nature since students are in here together typically. And then, like I said, the affective factors are definitely where a lot of the research has been done so far. But there have also been studies that have shown that it has led to better vocabulary, pragmatics. There's been some interesting work done with a lot of like role playing, where students can practice like, okay, is this the right thing to say? And then if they say the wrong thing, the AI character responds in kind of like a negative way. And they're like, oh, that might not have been polite. Listening, pronunciation, and speaking, and actually surprisingly reading. There's only been one study so far, so it's very, very beginning, but VR has largely been argued to be good for like listening and speaking skills, right? These oral interactions. But there was a study that just came out that showed that learners reading in VR, because they were able to see a lot of visual context of the story, they actually did understand better, and then they performed better on comprehension tests afterwards.
So Tricia, could I ask you a couple of questions about sort of longer term effects? So first of all, there's a question in the chat from someone who said that she tried the VR but got nauseous and vertigo, and wondered if that's something that wears off when you've been doing it more times, or whether it's just some people are more prone to that kind of feeling. Do you have any
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
yeah, Danielle, that's a great question. So it depends on a lot of different things. It depends on the headset. I will say, like, if you tried an older headset, they're just not, I don't know in terms of the system requirements or whatever, but they don't actually, they're not as high quality, I guess would be the word. And so a lot of people will feel more nauseous in those headsets. And then it also depends on the app. So some apps, if you have one, for example, there's a lot of roller coaster apps that they put people in for the first time. That's a terrible idea. If anyone recommends one of those to you, I highly, highly encourage you not to do it. Um, so it depends on the apps. Some are just, I don't know if it's the way that they're built on like the engineering side or just what you're doing in them. And then once you're in the app, it also depends on your type of movement that you choose. Some apps have two types of movement. One is called natural movement. And personally, I think that um, is like the worst thing you can do because it basically makes it look like you're physically moving, but your brain knows your body is not, but your brain thinks you are. So there's something between the disconnect there that will make a lot of people sick. So I would go for apps that allow you to teleport. So that's when you just click to a location on the ground and it puts you there. I found that that's really helpful. And then also just doing apps that aren't necessarily moving you around as much, like maybe apps where you're just walking, you're not like riding something, and then using a newer headset.
And I suppose, as you said near the beginning, that these things could also be done on a desktop computer. So if somebody is prone to nausea, they've got that option. I think there is a question in the chat about how expensive this is, and as you said, you'll be talking more about the cost. But a lot of these things are very cheap. It just depends on which way you access them. There's one other question about sort of longer term effects, which is, I mean, a tricky thing, really. Could it be that there's an increased motivation using VR, but then there's less motivation back in the classroom in reality?
Yeah, so two things on that. We have what's called the novelty effect, which is basically, well, of course people are going to be engaged because it is engaging, it's exciting, but does that engagement last over time? Are they still going to feel engaged 16 sessions in? I will say that unfortunately, because this tech is so new and it is more expensive and the research being done on it is still kind of more on the exploratory side versus like empirical. Or we do have empirical studies, but they're shorter term. They're not with a lot of participants. It's hard to say in terms of the long-term effects. That's something that we really still need in the field in terms of like research. So far, the longest studies we have are encouraging, but again, like they're not done over like a year. The longest I think we have is like 12 weeks.
Okay, I suppose with any new teaching strategy, whether it's something technology based or just a new idea, these things over time are something that as teachers we learn how to integrate, when to use it, how it can enhance a lesson, and when perhaps to do something more traditional.
Exactly. And then I feel like there was a second part to that question that, does the excitement of the classroom wear off?
Yes.
That is something, so I've seen this in two studies I've done, and I've actually seen opposite things occur. So in one study I conducted with these sixth graders in Spain, we did have that problem that when they were doing activities in VR, then when it was their time to go do like a comparable activity in the classroom, they're like, well, this one's boring. I don't know if that was partly because they're children. I don't know with adult learners if it'll be the same, but that was kind of an issue with them. But then when I was doing research with the university level students, because everything was happening during COVID, they were actually really happy when they were able to be back in person. Again, though, that was also with COVID going on. So
again, maybe it's the same with anything we do in our classroom. Sometimes, you come up with a really exciting, brilliant lesson, and then the next day you're just doing some exercises in the book and they say it's boring. You say, well, some days are like that.
Well, and I always tell students too, I'm like, I teach university level, so I'm like, it's not my job to always entertain you. It's my job to teach you. I hope the lessons are fun. That's obviously what we hope, but you know, we're all strapped for time, and you can't create a game or a super engaging lesson all the time. Sometimes they also just have to do more boring work.
I just want to mention there's a few more questions that have come up in the chat, but I think that Trish is going to cover quite
Okay.
a lot of those. So we'll just carry on, and if there's
Yeah.
questions remaining, then we'll come back to them.
Yeah, Lucy, I was trying to watch it, but it's
No,
moving.
it's my job. It's my job to watch it. You go ahead, you're presenting.
So I'll let you
No.
do. So I'm actually going to skip over this for now for the sake of time, and we can come back to it maybe at the end. This is just a list of kind of like things that are appropriate for VR. So again, things like total physical response, experiential learning. I saw something in the chat about collaborative learning. It definitely enhances collaborative learning because students are, I mean, it depends on the app you use, but all the ones that I'm going to be talking about, students are going to be in them together doing collaborative tasks. So yeah, and then here you have some ideas, but Lucy can also share my slides and y'all can read through.
Yeah, it'll be available through the recording. So yeah, everybody will have a chance to see it again.
Because this, I think, is more self-explanatory for all of us as teachers. So let's talk about different types of VR devices. So I'm going to try to break this down, but obviously if you have questions, put it in the chat. It ranges from most affordable to most expensive. Let's start with that. So most affordable are types of headsets that work with your smartphone. So we have things like Google Cardboard or any type of cardboard. It's not necessarily Google. There's also things like Google Daydream or like headsets that basically what you would do if you're using this is you actually open this little latch and you put your phone inside. So these range anywhere from like $5 for the cardboard to like 15 for this kind of like nicer version one.
And this is US dollars, isn't it?
Yes, these are US dollars.
It's not expensive. Just
yeah, I think right now it's pretty comparable between the pound and US dollars, but yeah, so not expensive at all. Again, they're using your smartphone, so keep in mind that when it's like most affordable and most expensive, the quality is going to change too. You know, like you're not going to have as high end of an immersive experience with Google Cardboard, but that doesn't mean you still can't do exciting things that won't work well with your classroom, right? So this is like, I call them viewing devices because that's what they are. You're pretty much just putting it on and you're looking at something in kind of a 360 experience, right? Then you have standalone headsets. So these are, well, you can see here, I also have one I can show you at the end if you want, but you essentially put this on and then these are the controllers that you hold and you interact with the environment. So this is more just observing. This is more actually getting in the space and interacting and doing things. These, the most popular one right now, at least on the US market, but I think like throughout the world in general, is the MetaQuest 2, and that is running at $400 a piece. So you can see there's a big jump between like Google Cardboard and the MetaQuest 2. There's also Pico. I'm going to drop that word in the chat. That is also becoming more and more popular. I've seen people talking about it in Europe, and I'm not, to be honest, I'm not 100% sure of the price point, but I think it's a little cheaper than the Quest 2 that you're seeing here in white. And then you also have on the most expensive end of the spectrum, you have VR headsets that can be tethered to a computer. These are things like the HTC Vive or Vive. You also can have the old Oculus Rift that looks very similar to this, but just tethered to a computer. I don't like these for teachers because they do have to be tethered to a computer and it has to be a high-powered computer. So it's really just not super accessible. The headsets are, for one, more expensive than the standalone headsets to anyways. And then you also have to have a really high-end like gaming computer. So if you see people talking about this, it's typically either gamers or some universities will set up like a virtual reality lab. Like my university had one where they had these types of headsets tethered to computers, but I don't think like the average teacher needs to get into this territory. These are about $1,500 a piece. And then you have to have the computer on top of that. So probably like $3,000 a setup.
There's a question in the chat here about how VR could be integrated with online learning, because there are teachers out there who just teach online. So is that a whole different question, or does that link to what you're talking about today?
We'll talk about that.
Great. Okay.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later.
Lovely.
Pretty much I will say like anything that you would do, and our clients are only interested in online availability. I guess what I will say, Jeremy, is I don't know how you teach your online classes. Like if you do a very specific online platform and everything needs to be done through that platform, I don't know if you could really integrate it. But if you're like meeting your students on Zoom, there's no reason that you couldn't hold a class in VR in one of the platforms we're going to see today.
Right. Just a time check, we're halfway through.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about different types of VR platforms. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through some broad categories, and then I'm going to show you some specific examples with like videos and stuff so you can try to get a better idea. But you have, to start, you have VR apps that have been specifically designed for language learning, and then you have more general social VR platforms. People are using both for education, but they have obviously their advantages and drawbacks, which we'll talk about. Within apps that are specifically made for language learning, you have ones that allow for human to computer interaction. So that is when like a learner would get into an app and interact with like a pre-programmed AI computer bot. There's two that exist. There's Mondly and there's Immerse Me. Mondly, I believe, is $30. Lucy, I'm going to also send you, well, at the end, y'all will see I have a link to a list of resources, and in that, it has all the pricing for these in one of the articles I can show you.
Right.
Mondly, if I remember correctly, is $30. Immerse Me is $300 a year. So that's if you use it for like your individual usage. They do say on their website that they allow or that they provide like bulk subscriptions for universities or schools, but I'm not sure what that pricing is. But it's definitely more expensive. I do like it though, because they've actually recorded all of their interactions in real locations around the world. So there's a lot more authenticity to it compared to Mondly. This looks the same if you're doing this activity in English, if you're doing it in Spanish, if you're doing it in Japanese. So there's no cultural elements really built into it. But again, you get what you pay for, right? So it still has merit. And these, I will say they're best for speaking practice, and they're best for students to kind of check their pronunciation, because the guide or the activity will give them some options. And if they choose, one and they try to say it and their pronunciation is completely off, it won't let them advance through the activity. And these are both available on desktop or like your desktop computer or in VR. There's also ones that allow for human to human interaction. So this is where you can actually be in this environment with multiple students and a teacher at the same time. Right now, the only one that was designed specifically for language learning that does this is Immerse. So that's the company I work for. And I'll show y'all kind of more in detail what it looks like later. But here you can see in this image, these are actual students in the classroom. So this is from a study. This is from when we taught those 6th graders in Spain. This is the picture of them outside VR with their little headsets on. And then these are their avatars. And we were doing an activity in the class, in the kitchen, where they had to like prepare a meal and prepare for a party and clean up and do a bunch of things.
So this is a group of students that you're teaching that are all together in the same app. So because there've been a few questions about collaboration, and you've mentioned that already. Yeah. So it seems that the students are collaborating just as they would together in the classroom, but they're doing it together in virtual reality.
Exactly. So all the apps I'm going to talk about moving forward, the students are in there together in real time, except for these human to computer interaction apps. Personally, I've never done research with the human to computer apps because I'm all about like spontaneous oral communication in the target language. So it's just not really in my realm. I'm more interested in like, what are students doing in real time together? But I didn't want to point it out because they are specifically designed for language learning. So they still have, use if you want students to practice at home on their own, but they're not like, I wouldn't bring them into a classroom and have students interacting individually. Okay. And then we have general social VR platforms. These are, think about them as like virtual meeting spaces almost, where students can come together and they can do a variety of different things depending on the app, but they weren't designed necessarily for educational purposes. And so they won't have as many like teaching tools as an app like Immerse would have. But there are a lot of educators that are still doing work in these apps because they do have some pedagogical affordances. And we'll look more in detail at Outcode specifically. I really like for language learning because they have a travel room, which has like a bunch of like preloaded tours from around the world. You can also access this other app that's essentially like Google Earth meets VR. And so this one I think is really interesting for language teachers. VTime XR is another one. I've done research with this app, and it's really nice for conversation practice because you're able, it's designed pretty much just for students to come together and speak. But in my work, I found that students liked being in the environment and actually added to their conversation because it gave them ideas about things to talk about, and kind of push them a little more than they would be if they were just in a normal classroom.
So again, I suppose if this is new to teachers, they might want to, or new to maybe the company or the school they're working for, then they could start with something that's really very low cost and just experiment and learn more about it. And then if it's successful, the students love it, they might decide to take the next steps.
Yeah, start low cost.
Yes.
I want to emphasize that as much as possible. Start low cost. These apps are completely free. Okay.
Right, amazing.
VTime are completely free. Alcove, unfortunately, is only accessible via VR, but VTime is accessible via smartphones. So I'm assuming most of your students have a smartphone. You could test it out for free in your classroom and just get their opinions. Again, it's not going to be the same fully immersive experience that you would have if they had a headset on, but really it's not, so I never recommend like going out and buying 30 headsets and just hoping for the best. Like you try out a bunch of free stuff, make sure you're really going to use it before you invest in this technology. There's also games. So like I said, VR is a lot of times used for gaming. And I've seen some people do interesting work with this for language learning. So you have multiplayer games where users can actually be in spaces together. So some common ones are Rec Room. There's another one called Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes, which sounds intimidating, but it's not violent. Really, it's more about you have to basically figure out how to like deactivate this bomb together. So it's a lot of negotiation. It's a lot of giving direction. So y'all can imagine how, okay, well, if you're doing that in the target language, obviously that's a pretty high level skill, right? So there's things like that where you could go in here and students could play in their native language and have a great time, but depending on how you want to craft it as a teacher, you can actually get them playing games and negotiating together in the target language.
And do you know if Keep Talking can be can be used a number of times? Does it sort of reset so there's new solutions?
Yeah, I played it a few times. It does reset. Yeah, it does reset. I'm not sure if there's like a finite number, but that would be definitely something to look into. But yeah, I'm pretty sure it gives you like multiple scenarios. And kind of like from what I remember when I played it, you have people play the role of like giving the instructions, and then you have the person who's actually having to listen and follow them and try to, it's pretty complex.
Sounds fantastic for high level learners. So it really gives them a motivation to communicate.
Yeah, this would definitely be a high level. Definitely not A1, A2, where I can see A2 level. And then you also have, so these are single player games. So I guess I lied when I said the rest are collaborative. These are single player, but Elixir is free. And it's on the MetaQuest 2 headset, but it's particularly interesting because you basically you're pretending to be like a apprentice learning how to work with this like sorcerer. And so you have to listen to her and follow a bunch of different directions. And it's available in like English, French, Spanish, German, Japanese. I can't remember all of them, but probably like 8 or 9 different languages. And I actually included at the end, y'all will see, but there's a professor here in the US that works on VR and language learning, and she wrote up a bunch of lesson plans that you could do using this app, and just some ideas of how it could be used to practice things like listening comprehension, and then even some like pre and post activities you could do in the classroom collaboratively. So that is also on that list that I'll give you at the end. And then we have what I've pretty much called exploration and 360 video tours. These are accessible from anything. Okay, they're accessible from your desktop, they're accessible in VR, they're accessible from your cell phone. I think this would be a great place to start if you're like, I've never used any of this stuff, but I think it could be kind of cool. If you go on Google, or if you go on YouTube and type in like 360 video tour of X, I guarantee you will probably find it. There are so many out there. This is just a screenshot of what it looks in Google Cardboard. It looks weird when you're not in VR, but I believe this was Venice. But yeah, that's obviously, I mean, it's great for just like having students experience what it feels like to really be in the location you're talking about. So I've used Wonder a lot. We'll see what it looks like more in depth on another slide, but it's essentially Google like Street View meets VR. So you can put on your headset and like physically walk around anywhere in the world, and students can actually be in the app together. So they can give each other tours of different locations. So yeah,
so they could maybe, if they're from different countries, they could take each other around a little tour of their city or something, a little place that they know.
Exactly.
Oh.
So we've used this in like a telecollaborative exchange where we've had students do just that. Like we had students in Japan and students in the US who were meeting. And so they met in Wander and they basically showed each other around their universities. And the US students had to give their tours in Japanese, and the Japanese students had to give their tours in English because that was the language they were learning. I've also used this with students. So when I was teaching, like, I think it was French 3, we were working on like describing cities. And so I did an activity where they had to visit 4 different cities in France that were all very different. Like, you know, you had like a massive city, a tiny little like fishing town, and then they had to describe them and kind of walk around them together using the vocabulary we have been practicing in class. And I've also used it even with like private tutoring. Like whenever I've been talking about different regions or different like famous monuments or locations, actually taking my students there and like doing like a tour of it so they can see it. So it's just a really good way of like infusing, I would say, more authenticity and more culture. And these, again, you don't have to be in VR. You could even just use, if you don't want Wander is in VR, but if you wanted to use the desktop version, it would be Google Street View. And you can also find 360 video tours of art museums. There's a ton online. I mean, really anything you can think of is out there on
there's a question in the chat. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. One person's asking how you would use VR in business English classes.
That is a great question. I never taught business anything, but I will say there's certain apps. So let me come back to that. Let's put that on pause for like 1 second. So I'm going to talk.
Or maybe other people in the chat might want to contribute to that, because if there may be some people who other people who teach business English, you've got some ideas.
Yeah. So this, again, I recommend Immerse Me for independent practice if you're wanting students to like do something from home using VR, but it's not collaborative in nature, right? So this is where they're interacting with AI computer bots. And so I wanted to just show y'all a quick, we're not going to watch the whole thing, but a very quick video so you can get an idea of what it looks like, because these things are, if you've never been in VR, it's really hard to imagine like what the heck is Tricia talking about right now. So let me show you, let me make sure I'm sharing my sound too. And the person you're seeing here, his name is Scott, I think it's Cardwell. Yes, Cardwell. He's the founder and CEO of Immerse Me. So he's basically explaining kind of what it is. I'll turn my volume up too.
What is Immerse Me's pedagogical value? Immerse Me transports students into a virtual 360-degree environment and allows them to interact with native speakers across 9 world languages. But we plan to continue developing content for dozens of languages.
So you can see they're basically kind of like in all different locations throughout the world, and they receive kind of a question or a prompt from the AI character or the virtual character, and then they have a variety of options they can choose from, and they respond back. And they do actually offer, I've tested it out, because another thing that I didn't like about Immerse Me initially was I felt like it was better for like lower level students, and I was more interested in students that were more advanced.
So so the interaction is done with sort of written messages rather than with spoken?
No, they speak. Yeah, they speak.
Okay,
yeah, but for example, but they have like 3 options to choose from.
Okay, all right, but the language level was a little lower than the proficiency levels, is that?
The language level, I will say it's better for like lower level students, because you can see here, for example, it's like ordering something in a bakery, right? So but they have kind of built out, last time I was looking at it, I was able to find like debate practice. So they do have some higher level stuff. But in general, I think it's more for kind of like those transactional exchanges, like ordering something at a restaurant or like buying something at the store. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to jump to Immerse. So who was asking the question about business English? I was going to say Immerse does have environments that are ideal for practicing things like debates or presentations or public speaking. We have like a networking environment. They have a presentation environment where you have like kind of fake people in the audience. You also have like the real students in there together, but they've added some extra people so you can kind of like get a feel for like, what does it feel to talk to an audience? Here, I think they're in, this might be like the talk show environment, but there are some environments that are more businessy in nature that you could practice in. But yeah, this is, like I said, Immerse is for live teaching and learning. And so what I really like is the teacher actually teaches from their desktop computer, and then students can either join in desktop or in VR. And you can see right here, we have like a Spanish lesson going on. So the teacher was able to put up different categories on the whiteboard, and then students can either add images, or you can also put different words on like the tiles and then drag them and organize things.
So the teacher of the class can program some things in according to what they want the students to learn.
Exactly. So the teacher has, we call it like the teacher interface that they teach from to allow for just a lot more control of students. And it has certain functions like, well, actually, let me show you. So it has certain functions like here, it's called rally. You can physically bring all the students to one location. You can also focus them, which kind of makes them freeze. And you can also bring in things like PowerPoints, whiteboards. Like I said, you customize the language that they're seeing. Here, our teacher was able to put in these pre-programmed questions because they're doing like a trivia game in Spanish. And so everything can already kind of be set up. And then when your students come in, you can just get started. I'm going to show you again a little video. This was actually us teaching in Immerse. I was teaching with a professor. His name was Dr. Sadler, so you'll hear him talking. And we had students, and we were basically playing like a guess who game. So the students had to pick a painting on the wall. You can see we have like short people, tall people, older people, younger people. And these were like A1 English level. So they basically have, okay, it's a man or it's a woman. She has gray hair, things like that. And then the other students had to try to guess who the student was describing. And so that's what you'll see here.
Me. Okay. Yes. Is a girl?
It's a girl. Nice. Okay.
Yes.
First clue. It's a girl. There's several girls. Okay. What can you tell us more?
Is old.
She's old. An old girl. Okay, I think I know. Can you tell us something else?
Yes. Her hair is gray.
Her hair is gray. Okay, I'm pretty sure I know. An old girl, gray
Or
hair.
white.
Or white, yeah. Which one? I see, Marsal, I see you were pointing. Which one are you pointing at?
The picture is this picture. Yes.
I think so too.
So you can see kind of what it looks like. I was on the teacher interface. So that's why you're seeing my little avatar, kind of observing them here doing this activity. So again, this is live interaction, excuse me. So the students they're not interacting with any fake pre-programmed things. Okay, it's all like done in real time. So that's why it's really up to the teacher to do whatever you want with your students, whatever you feel like makes the most sense. I'm gonna hop ahead because I'm being
we have 10 minutes and we've got a couple of questions.
Okay.
Drops at the end. Yeah.
So this is spatial. This is another social VR space that is not designed for language learning, but people have essentially gone in and created, it's kind of like a world that people constantly create things in, but you can have private spaces as well. So people have created like Japanese streets and stores, French coffee shops. It's free to use on desktop or VR. And what we've done with students is we've actually had them create in here kind of like an art gallery showcasing their work at the end of the semester. And then they come in and they have to kind of present it to the public, and it's kind of like a show and tell, so to speak. I'm gonna skip the video for now, but again, you can go back and watch it. We also have Alco. This is another social VR space that was actually created by the American Association of Retired People, but it's essentially a customizable house that students can meet up in, and they can watch videos, they can customize the images on the walls, they can play games together, and they also have a travel room. So this was the room I was talking about, where they can actually jump into preloaded tours together. They can visit space or locations throughout the world. So it's kind of like a very safe location because it's fully private. They won't encounter like any strangers, but there's a lot to do in here as well. And then you also have Mozilla Hubs. Mozilla Hubs is free and on a variety of platforms as well. So computer, phone, VR, you name it, they're on it. And one thing that I like about it is it has a bunch of pre-built scenes that you can choose from, but you can also import. They have like a massive database of 3D objects. So you can just click and literally be like, I want this in this space, and then you put where you want it to go. So there's no coding involved. So you can really customize it into whatever you need for your class. And you can also bring in images, documents, PDFs, etc. And this is a good space for like students doing collaborative tasks because they can build things together and make things together, but they also have some pre-built environments that are like mazes or like hide and seek and things like that students can do in here. And then this is Wander. So this is the one that I was talking about. I'm going to play this in mute so you can see, but this is kind of what you're seeing when you're inside the headset. So you can select a lot of different places throughout the world. And then they have an interesting feature as well that you're seeing over here in the video. It's like a time hop feature. So I could go to, for example, like the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris and view it 10 years ago versus viewing it now, and then talking about, okay, what is the difference here and why does it look so different? Well, it looks so different because there was a massive fire. Wander is $10, but it's a really interesting app. You can do a lot of things with it. I think it's really worth the investment. And like I said, students can be in Wander together. So they can actually like see each other's little avatars and do tours together and hear each other talking. Okay, so Lucy, I think I'll quickly go through these because these might address some of the questions.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So training is really important. I have some articles that are linked at the end that talk more about training, so definitely read those. But VR is not intuitive for everyone, and it's also kind of like a what's the word? like it kind of takes practice learning how to like walk someone through a VR headset. So definitely practice that with like your friends at home before you're trying to explain it to an entire group of students. There's also an interesting feature called casting that you can do from inside the headsets, and that's where you can actually show students what you're seeing in VR in your headset. And that's really useful when you're training, because then they can actually see, okay, this is what I should be seeing when I'm in there. Equipment and classroom setup. This I just wanted to note because setting up VR equipment, it does take time. So you want to make sure everything's like connected to Wi-Fi, everything is updated, downloaded before you have your students come in. Sometimes school Wi-Fi's can be a little more tricky because of security features. So you just want to make sure everything's like up and running before your students come into class. And then if they are physically using VR in class together versus like joining from home, you want to be mindful of like how much distance is between students, because they can't see each other once they're in these headsets and they're moving their arms, right? So you just want to make sure that there's like enough of a radius where they won't hit each other. And then of course, privacy and safety features. All the apps I showed to you today are either like completely private or they have the option to make a private space. But that's definitely something to be mindful of. Some of these apps, since they are social in nature, if you don't make a private space, students might encounter like someone random, which you don't want. And then in terms of getting VR headsets, like I said at the beginning, don't buy a set of 30. I mean, unless you just like really have the money and want to. I would start with like a maximum a set of 3 or 4. Even if you're deciding if you want to use this, just start with one. There are grants that are offered through companies like Meta that are actively looking for educators to like give VR headsets. A lot of university campuses now have VR labs as well, or like loanable headsets that students can check out. And then also, again, like use the cheaper VR devices that work with smartphones or desktop options. You know, you don't have to buy a high-end headset, especially at the beginning. And then just things to keep in mind, internet. You want to make sure you have a reliable internet connection. It doesn't need to be anything like crazy, but just like a solid internet connection that you would use for like Zoom or something. Again, we talked about this a little bit, but depending on the app you use, like some can make students cautious or dizzy. So test it out on yourself first. Make sure you find it comfortable. And then also I always choose apps that can be accessed via the desktop as well. So if I have a student that doesn't want to do VR, they can just join via desktop and it's not a big deal. Again, privacy, be mindful. Bullying and harassment goes under privacy. So that would just be the thing. Like if you're teaching adult learners, you might be comfortable with them being in a social app where they might encounter strangers, but just keep in mind, you know, it's the same issues we have online with everything. And then right now, the issue with VR, like I've said a million times, is cost. So making sure that you're providing this equipment for your students. And then I'm going to throw this up. This QR code goes to a link of resources that I basically put together, and it's all like articles that talk about like using VR for pedagogy versus like research articles. So some of them are written by me, some of them are written by like other people I know, but it's a lot of like tips and tricks and like ideas and things like that.
Amazing, amazing, so great. So I think you've certainly covered a few of the questions that have come up. So one person's doing an MA thesis related to this, it seems, so they'll be able to find some reading through that QR.
Yeah, I will say for the MA thesis person, feel free to email me and I'm happy to share more of like the research resources if you feel like that would be useful. And like more of the theoretical.
Great. Is your I think maybe, oh great, it's on there. Okay. A couple of very specific questions. You mentioned Google Daydreamer, and one person was asking if that's still available. They thought maybe it wasn't available anymore.
I haven't checked for Google Daydream. If it's not available anymore, they have, I mean, there's a million different versions of it.
Okay, great. I think a couple of questions related, I think, to Immerse, because they were a while back. Okay. How many participants does it support, and can you try it for free?
So right now, Immerse supports up to 8 students at a time in one lesson, and that's just because, you know, if you get too many students in there, it's kind of an overload. anyone who's interested in trying Immerse, if you go to immerse.online, I'm putting that link in the chat, you can learn more. You can also email me. I'm happy to get you set up. Depending on what you want to do, we have research partners where we'll give people free access to the app to conduct research. But you could also try it for free just from like the student perspective to see kind of what you think. But yeah, look at the website and then feel free to follow up with me and I can work with everyone kind of on like a case-by-case basis.
That's amazing, wonderful. One thing that I think you've talked about, but I just wanted to ask on is the avatars. So students can they choose with all of these apps what their avatar is? And from what our discussion that we had a few weeks ago, it seems that that is something that really helps with confidence, because they don't feel so much like they're there as themselves. They've got a little character, and it helps them to interact more freely and with less without feeling so shy. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And so in all the apps I showed, they can choose their avatar. I think Wander, so like the Earth one, I think that's the only one that kind of like automatically assigns them just like a color. But every other app where they're actually like really interacting like face to face, quote unquote, with someone, they can choose what their avatar looks like. And depending on the app, they can customize it more or less. But yeah, you're exactly right. That's why a lot of the studies show that they have lower anxiety, because students are really shielded in a sense. And I found that a lot in my research with students being like, well, I feel more comfortable because no one can see me, even though the classmates that they were interacting with knew them in real life. So they weren't anonymous, you know, or like, well, they can't see me. They can't see my facial expressions. They can't see all my body language. I'm not really making eye contact. So yeah, there's a lot of work that's been done on that.
Incredible. I mean, it seems that there's so much possibility with this. Teachers just need to spend a bit of time learning and practicing and experimenting beforehand, which sounds like fun too. And
it's
then
hard to
give it a go.
into an hour.
Yes. No, I think there's.
But really, if you're interested, I really encourage you to like check out the list of resources. Again, they're not research articles. They're all articles that were written for like educators, meant to be like really accessible and really like hands-on and practical. And then you're always welcome to email me and I'll do it.
Well, there's more questions coming up in the chat, but we don't have time for those. So maybe you might get a little influx of emails of more questions related to this, because it seems really exciting.